This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. My guest this week is wildlife author and photographer Paul Sterry. Paul has written many books on wildlife, but his latest, The Biodiversity Gardener, pulls together his decades of knowledge, and the result is a wildlife gardening manual with real-life examples taken from Paul's Hampshire wildlife-friendly space. I love Paul's honesty and passion for nature, and this book has gone straight into my top 5, maybe top 3 books for wildlife gardening. And if you listen to the podcast, you'll know just what great company this places it in. Here's Paul talking about the book and his journey to becoming a gardener for biodiversity.
Well, I've been interested in natural history, I can't quite say from birth, but certainly from as long as I can remember. My mother was a biology teacher, so I think that probably encouraged me to explore the natural world more freely than might have otherwise been the case. I went through the usual secondary education and went to university to study zoology and applied entomology, and then had a brief flirting with academia. I did a PhD in parasite ecology, of all things, and parasite biochemistry, and then worked as an ecologist at Sussex University for a few years, and then decided I wanted to go freelance and return to the passion of my youth, which is natural history. So the way to do that, I felt at the time, was to write books and illustrate them using photographs. And by that stage in my life, photography had become a big part of my day-to-day existence, as it still is today. So I first encountered the cottage and garden where I live, I suppose maybe 60 years ago, because it turns out that I used to tag along with my father when he visited the then owner of the house, and they were both radio hams, which many people won't have heard of today, but it's a pastime, a hobby, whatever you want to call it, that exists to this day. So they were both radio hams. I tagged along and was captivated by the charm of the cottage and the natural history of the surrounding area. So I used to pester my father to carry on, and we go and explore local forests and heathlands and look for butterflies and things like that. And essentially, purely by chance, about 25 years ago, unbeknown to me, the cottage came on the market, and it was one of the properties that I looked at and suddenly had a realization. It was like an Agatha Christie moment. It started coming back to me, these recollections of the past. And to cut a long story short, I ended up buying the place and moving in. And all was well for the first, decade perhaps. But I gradually became more and more aware that the surrounding countryside and wildlife that I knew and loved and valued in my youth was disappearing as fast as anywhere else in the world. And as a consequence, that's what encouraged me to embark on the project that is the garden, which was returning the garden to a semblance of the habitats that I knew and loved in my youth. So that's meadows, hedgerows, woodland, scrub. So those are the habitats that I encouraged in the garden. And I suppose the trigger, I guess there were 2 triggers for writing the book. And as with a lot of people, lockdown played a part in this, but also lockdown, I suppose, focused my attention on what was going on in my immediate surroundings more than had been the case prior to that, because I'd been traveling a lot and, seeing the world. But being forced to stay at home for long periods and concentrate on what was happening locally, I decided that something had to be written that set down for the record what was happening and what the British countryside, English countryside could and should be, and could be if future landowners have a change of environmental heart. So that was the genesis for the book, and the genesis for the origins of my embarking on my biodiversity journey.
Brilliant. On the podcast, I have interviewed various people about wildlife gardening, some of the real experts like yourself, like Dave Gorson and Jeff Ollerton, and people who really know what they're talking about. And one of the things that I always wonder about gardens and biodiversity is that obviously I understand that gardens take up a fair amount of the UK land space, but then I do wonder if we keep on building these wildlife gardens in the image, that we see them to be beneficial or in a way that it works for us as well, do they risk becoming unsupportable islands of life in a wider landscape that's really not very biodiverse or really where they're facing very big challenges?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. In a sense, my garden is it's not a garden for me, it's a garden for biodiversity, and it's become almost a Noah's Ark. You're correct in saying that if it's gardens alone, all that we're doing is creating these little bubbles of biological complexity, and those isolated bubbles do not a healthy environment make. The ambition that I've got for my garden, and maybe others would like to follow suit, is that it's a Noah's Ark of biodiversity that represents what used to occur in the local landscape, in the hope that in the future, landowners in the vicinity will have a change of environmental heart, and bluntly, that they won't take after their parents and will see the light and want to restore the environment. And if there aren't these Noah's Arks of biodiversity, where on earth is the biodiversity going to come that is required for restoration projects? Because you can plant a few trees, you can scatter a few seeds, but for example, a healthy meadow will host, thousands, literally thousands of plants and animals, invertebrates in particular, that you can't buy these things. They have to colonize and come from somewhere. And if not biodiversity gardens like mine and plots of land where nature is given the upper hand, then where? I'm slightly encouraged because in the immediate vicinity of me, let's say within 2 or 3 miles, there are a handful of people who are embarking on the same projects, either turning small plots of land or 3 acres here, 10 acres there of what was industrial farmland, managing the land for the benefit of wildlife, should we say, rather than for agricultural output. And they started with very little, and colonization from what remains of the landscape is occurring. And there is definitely a case to be made that gardens like mine punch above their weight, if you like. They offer a chance for colonization of similar landscapes in the vicinity to be restored. So there is a glimmer of hope. And they aren't just bubbles of biodiversity sitting in sterile isolation. If all neighbouring landowners did nothing, then that would be the case. But I am encouraged because there are people who are also embarking on this process on a larger scale than mine. So, I can only hope that future generations will be more inclined to want to restore the landscape and the English countryside to the wildlife richness that it had in my youth. And without gardens like mine and plots of land like mine, where is this biodiversity going to come from?
It's a sobering thought, and at the end of your book, it will resonate for anybody who lives in an area where they have witnessed development.
Yes. In my darker moments, I must admit, I don't hold up much hope for planet Earth, let alone English wildlife. But I work on the basis that I might be wrong. I hope I am.
I hope you are as well. It does mean that gardening becomes a really important focus, and private gardens become a focus for nature conservation. I will go on to that a little bit at the end, but in practical terms, I was reading your book and I try and garden for wildlife myself, and there's loads of things, and I think you keep reiterating it throughout the book, that actually there's lots of things we can't identify, there are lots of things we don't know about interspecies relationships, and there were things, for example, on butterfly caterpillars. And I thought, well, that's great. I've got a little area of meadow, but when can I cut it? And it's practical considerations like that I think you talk about in your book. And I think there's a balancing act, isn't there, to do maintenance, to maintain the garden in a particular state and to respect wildlife.
Yes, in some senses, there's no good time to manage the land for wildlife. There's always going to be an impact on some species or other when you, for example, cut the grassland, but it's understanding the time to cause least harm and maximum benefit. In essence, all you have to do with a meadow is think about turning the clock back 2 centuries, because our forebears weren't conservationists, and yet the way they managed the land created the biodiversity that I knew in my youth and would love to celebrate for future generations to be able to celebrate in the future. So if you picture the way people would have, for example, cut meadows, which would have been an entirely economic outlook on life, it would be cutting hay in order to have food for animals during the winter months. So they weren't intending to benefit biodiversity, but an unintended consequence was that they did so. So if you cut, for example, the meadow, your grassland, however large or small, as late in the season as you possibly dare, that's always a good thing, because the caterpillars, it varies between species. Some butterflies have eggs that overwinter, some butterflies have chrysalises that overwinter, others, many of the meadow butterflies, have caterpillars that overwinter, either as tiny, tiny stages hidden between, inside little tents made amongst the grasses, or larger forms at ground level where they will have spun a little silken cocoon to protect themselves from the elements. So my advice would be to cut as late in the season as possible. That's typically, for me, late August, early September. Don't cut too close to the ground. Don't try to picture a golf course as your end result. Try and picture a scruffy 6 inches to 1 foot tall sward. And bear in mind that your meadow will also develop anthills. I've got anthills that have grown in the 10 years that I've been managing the garden as I do, that are, nearly a foot tall. So if I use a mechanical process and cut the meadow to within an inch of its life, I'd be destroying not only many of the meadow butterflies, destroying entire life cycles, but ants and grasshoppers and all sorts of things as well, which add to the complexity of the meadows. I mean, in the past, historical records indicate that entire families would have been employed by local landowners to cut the hay, to turn it and to stack it. Picture people in the past with scythes and nothing more than scythes and a rake, and do the same sort of light touch approach, leaving, a sward of vegetation rather than, a billiard board of cut grass. So a buzz cut is not a good thing, but a trim definitely is.
You were saying about the silver ground carpet moth on things like cleavers. And again, if you want to leave things for wildlife, you could leave cleavers, but then the chances are you're going to pull them out of your hedge or wherever they happen to occur at the end of the year and things. So is another good thing to just kind of leave stuff as long as possible in situ?
Yes, I mean, leave things as long as possible. I mean, cleavers is an interesting case in point. The evidence suggests it's one of these things that benefits, along with nettles, from nitrogen enrichment, and that can take the form of agricultural runoff, of course, but probably my garden is nitrogen rich from having 4 centuries of people, adding animal manure to the land, because in a past life it almost certainly would have fed the series of families that lived in the cottage. So I leave cleavers and nettles where I want them to, in proportion, shall we say, in the hedgerow margins and amongst the flower beds, but I probably would consider discouraging rampaging cleavers in some circumstances. So it's about a balance, and it's, everyone would have to make their own decisions about what constitutes a reasonable balance. But I like cleavers, but in moderation. And it's one of these things that if I were to ignore it completely, it would probably do its best to take over until the nitrogen in the soil had been depleted, which would be, it's going to take several decades.
Yeah. And like you say, there's tolerance to certain things, and
some people I'm not a tidy gardener by any means, and nor am I, particularly tidy in any aspect of my life. I'm fairly sort of laid back, shall we say. So the sight of cleavers and nettles doesn't offend me as it might do somebody with, shall we say, a Jekyll-ian, a Gertrude Jekyll approach to plants being sort of in their place and where they should be. I just let things do what they want to do, but take a fatherly overview of what I want the outcome to be.
Which kind of brings me around to the idea of scrub as well, which you talk about in
Yeah.
your book. And I have to say, from my experience of the site where I am, the scrub is, I think, the most, certainly for bird life. I mean, I'm not great at identifying much else, but it's alive, the scrub areas. And I do think to myself, should I manage that in order to keep it scrub, or should I let it transition into what it wants to be, which is, woodland?
Difficult question. I mean, it depends on the size and the space. I guess in my garden, what I'm doing is trying to, as I say, manage the plot to encourage the different habitats that foster the biodiversity of my youth. And that does mean, in a sense, setting those habitats in aspic, if you know what I mean. So rather than allowing my meadow to transition to scrub and hence to woodland, I maintain it and manage it to keep it as a meadow. And similarly with scrub, it's finding a balance so that you've got a nice mix of bramble and blackthorn and hawthorn at one extreme and, youthful stages at the other. So periodically, I probably will in time cut back some of the scrub so that it remains more youthful, whilst any trees that choose to colonize, I may well choose to move in their infancy and put them in the hedgerow section. So in a sense, that is the gardening aspect that I undertake. The rest of it is done purely by nature. Nature is the gardener, but I'm the overseer, the guardian angel that decides which bits shall remain meadow and which bits are destined for scrub and which bits will become woodland margins, as it were.
I think people can find it quite daunting to take that hands-off approach. And I loved your book from the second I opened it, honestly, and it really struck a chord. And I liked what you said about, how to get started. And one of your things was to cancel your gardening magazine subscriptions, which I found funny.
Slightly tongue-in-cheek, but
I
I don't
can
want to
imagine.
offend anybody, but yes.
But, if people do want to start, if they're looking to transition away from conventional gardening to wildlife gardening, what would you recommend they do?
The starting point, I guess, is to look at your local landscape and see what the good natural habitats are. If you've got wonderful meadows, within a 5-10 mile radius of you, and you've got a similar soil type, and you feel that those meadows are probably beleaguered and under threat, then it's probably meadows that I would concentrate on. I mean, the good quality, unimproved grassland is, in my part of the world, the most threatened habitat. There's probably enough woodland in the vicinity for it to look after itself, but the meadow habitats are really in a shocking state. Things that look green aren't necessarily good for wildlife. So you'll have grassy fields that probably have one or two species and are completely inappropriate for any form of, invertebrate colonization. So at a very rough guess, I mean, I think probably 90% of what 200 years ago would have been prime unimproved meadow habitat has gone. And meadows were the joy of my youth. So I think that's really what has been my focus of attention. And I think many other people in lowland England would find that meadows are pretty much the most beleaguered habitat. If you're fortunate enough to live, for example, on sandy soil that historically might have been heathland, your ambition might be to turn a significant part of your garden into heathland habitat. So you would grow appropriate species or encourage appropriate species. So heather, crossleaved heath, bell heather, depending on whether your underlying soil was wet or dry. And if you lived on an area that was chalk and had formerly been chalk downland, your ambitions might be to restore chalk downland flora, which would be entirely different from the clay neutral soils where I live. So I think meadows are always the central joy of any garden, I feel, but frame the garden, whatever the garden is, with hedgerows. And again, all you have to do if you really want advice is to look at your local hedgerows. You can look at historical records such as enclosure maps, which will be available in your local archives, your county archives. That will give you an idea of where relatively old, 2 centuries old hedgerows can be found, and you can do your own survey work, identify the species that are in there, and use that as a planting plan, not only in terms of species but proportion for the margins of your garden. So there's nothing better than a garden framed with a nice hedgerow, and why not have entirely native? Once you've created the structure, the framework of a hedgerow, the rest will follow. There'll be an understory of herbaceous perennials and annuals that will colonize. And, in an ideal world, your hedgerow will blend seamlessly into your meadow, and larger trees will give you a representation of any woodland in the vicinity. That's one approach. And if you're also interested in a freshwater component, you can't go wrong with some form of pond. So my advice would be to look at the ponds around you, try to figure out how they play a role in the native biodiversity. And the single most important thing would be to look at ponds near you. And if you see anything that's thriving in terms of plants, avoid it like the plague, because it will soon colonize your pond and you'll have a management problem on your hand and a transition from freshwater to dry land before you know it.
Yes, I think you're right about observing. It's easy to just try and create a garden that's all things to all species, but probably not sensible in terms of gardens, even if you've got a very large one. But my final question is, at the end of your book, you mentioned something that you'd like to see exist, and you've called it the Nature Conservancy Council. And I would welcome people to take this challenge on. But what is that, and why might we need it?
Yes, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek reference to the original conservation organisation that appeared in the wake of the austerity years following the Second World War, and that was called the Nature Conservancy. In its day, it was a fantastic organisation. It would speak truth to power. It catalogued and recorded everything that was good and everything that was deteriorating in the countryside, and it had real power. And subsequently, over the decades, it's been eviscerated, carved up, and watered down in terms of its ability to influence the broader conservation picture, the bigger picture. And as a consequence, I feel that there's no single organization that really represents the biodiversity that I know and love in my garden and knew and loved in the surrounding countryside. Nobody with a willingness to actually step up to the plate and say, enough is enough. There are dozens, hundreds of conservation organizations, all of which do a sterling job. But the problems that, as I see it, that they face are that they're often single taxa group interests. So dragonflies, for example, beetles, flowers, mosses, liverworts. And the power of persuasion, not only for public, but the influence on politicians and government, comes from having a louder voice, a larger voice, a bigger audience that can only come from having an overarching organisation. To a degree, the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust do fulfil that role, and the RSPB is a strong campaigning voice. But what it needs, I think, is something that helps the individual like me. I haven't been able to find anybody. I'm part of the reason why I wrote the book. It's really difficult to find advice about not only what I should be doing in the garden, what I should have done, but how to combat the dark forces at work in the surrounding environment. I think most people with a passion for wildlife, you can either stick your head in the sand and pretend everything is all right and there's nothing going wrong. But if you open your eyes, you'll see that biodiversity and wildlife conservation is taking a nosedive. And it would be really useful to have an organization that actually advocated for what people are doing at the local level, the individual level, and took a look at the bigger picture and could advise people on not only how to manage their land for the benefit of wildlife, but how to fight back on behalf of nature.
A big thank you to Paul for taking the time to talk to me. Thanks to you for listening, and thank you to the super smart and talented Sally Bauer for telling me about Paul's book. So are there any volunteers out there who want to set up the Nature Conservancy Council? Seriously, you should get hold of a copy of Paul's book if you can. The end section deals with government and local councils and the legal and planning systems and the overall nationwide lack of protection for nature. Paraphrasing Paul a bit, he writes that even the people tasked with protecting nature sometimes don't do a great job, and I would go so far as to say many are bought and paid for. We need to be acting now and calling out apathy and inaction and greenwashing when we see them. We can hold to account the people and organisations that are set up to help nature if we feel they're not doing a great job. On this subject, I know I quite often bash the RHS, but at the Chelsea Flower Show this year, there was a section on houseplants, and one of the stands there was promoting British-grown houseplants, which sounded like a great idea, so I went and spoke to the guy on the stand. And I said to him, so do you propagate all your houseplants or grow them from seed in the UK? And he said, well, no, we buy them in as young plants from the continent, which is completely not British-grown plants. And there was this stand at the Chelsea Flower Show reaching out to hundreds of thousands of people all over the media, getting promoted as something that is, yes, it's better than the broken system we currently have, but please don't hold it up as something that is perfect or is completely sustainable. RHS, you do this. You need to do better. I pick on you because you're the only gardening organisation that is set up specifically for gardeners. You're a massive charity. You need to do the work. If you can't do it, get out of the way. Let other people have some grants and funding that you're currently going for. I know there's politics involved. It's not good enough. It doesn't wash anymore. Apologies, rant over, but it's not good enough. What we're doing is not good enough. Read the book, please. Get involved in politics. Get involved in any avenue that you think can help. Just stand up and shout. Shout at people. Call them out on social media. Ask people what they're doing to make a difference. And if they're saying they're making a difference and they're really not, point it out. It's fine. Ask questions. Ask awkward questions. We need to change this, and we've all got the power to do it. We've got the power to do it with our wallets and our voices. And en masse, if nobody else is doing it, we have to get together and do it ourselves. So, as I say, apologies, rant over. I know if you're listening to the podcast, you are already on board with this, but we do need to push, I think, for bigger change and faster change. And we need to hold people to account because nothing is getting done at a higher level and it needs to start from the ground up. Anyway, back to the dulcet tones of Dr. Ian Bedford. And he is giving us the lowdown on a cute-looking garden assassin.
One of the most successful taxonomic groups of insects on Earth is Diptera, with over 100,000 species already recorded, out of more than 1 million that are thought to exist worldwide. Dipterans are the true flies, with just one pair of wings, unlike other flying insects such as dragonflies and butterflies, which have 2 pairs. And there'll be many true flies that visit our gardens each year, who will demonstrate just how amazingly diverse they are in appearance, behaviour, and the roles they play within an ecosystem. And one that's certainly worth looking out for during spring and early summer is the dark-edged bee fly. Bee flies, of which there are 10 species in Britain, are so called because they look like small bumblebees with plump furry bodies and emit a high-pitched buzz as they fly amongst the plants. However, they don't sting, and their single pair of wings and long, spear-like tongue that protrudes from their head clearly shows they are not a bee. The dark-edged bee fly is the most common of the bee flies, and is an astonishingly fast and adept flyer, able to hover motionless in front of a flower while siphoning nectar before vanishing in the blink of an eye. But why would these flies have evolved to look like a not-so-skillful flying bee? Well, perhaps mimicking a stinging insect deters certain predators, but it's also likely that it helps the bee fly accomplish a sinister part of its life cycle. Since the dark-edged bee fly is actually a lethal parasite and, looking like a bee, probably enables it to get close to its prey, the solitary mining bees, and perform its rather devious egg-laying procedure. Having located a colony of mining bees, the female bee flies hover nearby. Then as the bees finish excavating their nests, lay their eggs and store pollen for their resulting grubs, the flies move closer and, whilst continuing to hover, begin flicking their eggs into the nests before the entrances are sealed by the bees. Then as the fly eggs hatch into maggots, they start by feeding on the stored pollen before finally consuming their main course, the mining bee grubs. The maggots then pupate, ready to emerge as the next generation of fluffy bee fly adults that once again begin their lives buzzing amongst the flowers and innocently drinking nectar.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.